My name is Natalie Vale Ashford. I am 34 years old. At 2:17 p.m. on a Wednesday in March, the concierge at a resort in Park City, Utah, called to confirm that my husband had just revoked my suite key, removed my seat from the charter flight manifest, and transferred my $100,000 deposit to the open bar tab for his sister's wedding weekend. There were 70 people about to watch me get erased from an event I would paid for. What Brandon didn't know when he told the staff I was acting like a victim, and it is not attractive, was that the resort he was using to humiliate me answered directly to me. The payroll, he thought, gave him authority. My signature was at the bottom. Before I tell you what happened when I walked into that rehearsal dinner, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story genuinely resonates with you. Drop a comment and let me know where you are watching from, and what time it is there. Now, let me take you back to how a marriage that looked perfect from the outside became a masterclass in financial gaslighting. I was 29 when I married Brandon Ashford. He was charming, ambitious, and came from a family that threw the kind of parties where people wore their class like armor. I worked as an executive operations director for a hospitality holding company. That is what I told people. What I didn't mention was that my family's trust had restructured 5 years earlier, and I would quietly become the chairwoman and majority shareholder of the portfolio that included 3 flagship mountain resorts. Brandon knew my family had money. He didn't know the exact structure. I wanted to see if he would love me without a title attached. At our engagement party in Greenwich, Brandon introduced me to a room full of investors. "This is Natalie," he said, wrapping an arm around my waist. "She handles admin work, keeps everything running smoothly." Someone asked what I did specifically. Before I could answer, Brandon laughed and added, "She likes spreadsheets." We let her feel important. The room chuckled. I smiled and stayed quiet. I told myself it wasn't worth correcting him in public. That was the first mistake. 3 years into our marriage, Brandon's venture, a boutique consulting firm that sounded impressive but generated almost no revenue, needed $38,000 to cover a gap before investors pulled out. He came to me late at night, stressed, hands shaking. "Just a bridge loan," he said. "I will pay you back in 6 weeks." I wired the money the next morning. 6 weeks came and went. 2 months later, I overheard him at a dinner party, telling a friend that the family floated me a bridge loan to stabilize the quarter. He didn't say my name. He said the family, as if it were some collective pot he had access to, not money I had transferred from an account he didn't appear on. I confronted him that night in our apartment overlooking the Hudson. "You told David it was family money," I said. He looked genuinely confused. "It is. You are my family." I tried to explain the difference. He cut me off. "You are being unnecessarily precise about this." That phrase stayed with me. Unnecessarily precise. As if accuracy about my own money was pedantic. 18 months before the wedding weekend, we attended Christmas dinner at his parents' estate in Connecticut. The house was one of those old money properties with a circular driveway, hedges trimmed into geometric precision, and staff who opened doors before you reached them. I wore a black silk dress from the row, paired with the Cartier tank, watch my grandmother had left me, understated but expensive. I had learned that in Brandon's world, the right clothes were a language, and I was trying to speak it fluently. His mother, Vivienne, looked me over as I walked into the foyer, her gaze moving from my shoes to my hair in one practiced sweep. "You are lovely, dear," she said, voice dripping with something I couldn't name yet. "Just a little corporate. Not quite dinner party." She touched my shoulder as she said it, a gesture that looked affectionate but felt like an evaluation. Brandon's sister Celeste, dripping in Cartier, and wearing a dress that probably cost more than my car payment, leaned against the marble banister and smirked. "Department store energy," she murmured, just loud enough for me to hear, but quiet enough to have plausible deniability. I looked at Brandon. He didn't defend me. He didn't even acknowledge that anything had been said. He just smiled at his mother and complimented the decorations. On the drive home, I asked why he would let them speak to me that way. "You have to understand how this crowd works," he said, eyes on the road. hands at perfect 10 and 2 on the steering wheel of the Mercedes I had helped him lease. Image matters. You cannot just show up however you want. I asked what that meant. He sighed. The kind of sigh that suggested I was being deliberately obtuse. You are smart, Natalie, you are capable. But you don't know how to play the game. The game, apparently, was performing wealth loudly enough that people forgot to ask where it came from. 6 months before the wedding, there was another incident. Brandon's firm was pitching a major client, a tech CEO, who wanted consulting on hospitality partnerships. Brandon asked if I could make an introduction to one of our resort properties for a site visit. I arranged it. The client was impressed. The deal closed. At the celebration dinner, Brandon's business partner toasted him as a connector who knows how to leverage relationships. I was sitting right there. Brandon raised his glass and accepted the compliment without mentioning that I had made the call. That it was my relationship with the property GM that had gotten them the tour, or that the partnership opportunity he had presented was built on access I had provided. When I brought it up later, he looked genuinely confused. You wanted credit for a phone call? He asked. That is when I started to understand the pattern. They didn't need me. They needed what I had: the money, the access, the network. But they wanted me smaller, quieter, less visible. As long as I wrote the checks and stayed out of the frame, I was useful. The moment I took up space, I became a problem. I told myself I was being mature by letting it go. I see now that I was just training them to see my silence as permission. The stakes weren't just about money, though the numbers were staggering when I finally sat down and tracked them. Over 5 years, I had wired Brandon $38,000 for his failed venture. I had covered $12,600 in membership dues for a club he insisted would open doors but never attended. I would paid $9,400 to clean up a private travel disaster where he had double-booked flights and blamed an assistant who didn't exist. I kept a spreadsheet, not because I planned to use it, but because part of me needed proof I wasn't imagining the imbalance. The $100,000 deposit for his sister's wedding weekend was the largest single transfer. When Brandon asked me to cover it, he framed it as an investment in family goodwill. Celeste has always felt competitive with you, he said. This is a way to show we are supportive. I didn't love Celeste. She had spent years making passive comments about my clothes, my job, my vibe. But I agreed because I wanted peace. I wanted to believe that if I was generous enough, patient enough, quiet enough, they would eventually see me as one of them. What I didn't calculate was the emotional cost. Every time Brandon rewrote the origin of money I had given him, I lost a little bit of my own story. Every time his family dismissed me as corporate or intense or a little much, I shrank a bit more. My husband was using my resources to build a version of himself that didn't include me except as an invisible support system, and the worst part wasn't that he was doing it. The worst part was that I was letting him. My business partner, a woman named Diane, noticed the shift before I did. Over coffee in my office, 3 months before the wedding, she asked if I was okay. You have been apologizing for taking up space, she said, even in meetings where you are the one with final authority. I didn't have an answer. That night, I called my Aunt Eleanor, the woman who had taught me to read contracts before I could drive. If you stay quiet to keep the peace, she said, eventually they will mistake your silence for agreement, and then they will resent you for not performing gratitude loudly enough. That is when I made a decision. I wasn't going to fight for a seat at a table where I was already paying for the chairs. I would attend the wedding weekend. I would be civil, but I would also stop pretending that silence was the same as dignity. The next time someone tried to erase me, I would make sure the correction was impossible to ignore. I was sitting in my office in Manhattan, looking out at the skyline, when my phone rang at 20:17 p.m. The caller ID showed the Park City Resort's main line. I answered, expecting a routine confirmation about the weekend, maybe a question about dinner preferences or arrival times. Instead, I heard Mara, the senior concierge, speaking in a voice so careful it immediately set off alarms. Mrs. Ashford, she said, and there was a tremor beneath the professional tone. I am calling to confirm some changes your husband requested. She paused. The silence stretched long enough that I could hear my own heartbeat. He asked us to remove your suite credentials, remove your name from the charter manifest, and redirect your deposit to cover beverage overages for the event. The room went silent in a way that felt physical, like someone had pulled all the air out through the windows. I set down the pen I had been holding. I am sorry, I said, voice very even. Could you repeat that? She did. Slower this time. And I could hear the discomfort in every syllable. She was reading from notes, which meant she had written this down to get it exactly right. Did he say I approved this? I asked. The pause that followed was too long. I could hear her breathing. He said you were experiencing some stress related to the event and preferred discretion. I felt something shift inside me, like a lock turning. Not anger yet. Something colder. Mara, I said, keeping my voice level. I need you to do something for me. Don't process any of those requests yet. Lock them as pending. I will call you back in 20 minutes. I heard her relief through the phone. Yes, madam. Understood. I hung up and stared at my phone. The city kept moving outside my window, taxis honking, people walking, the world continuing, like nothing had changed. But something had changed. In my chest, I felt it. The final thread of patience snapping. Then the phone rang again. Brandon, I answered. Natalie, he said. And his tone was the one he used when he thought I was being unreasonable. Like he was already preparing to manage my emotions. We need to talk about this weekend. I didn't say anything. He took my silence as permission to continue. You have been making this difficult, he said. The mood is off. People are asking questions. Celeste is stressed. If you cannot show up correctly, maybe it is better. You don't show up at all. I felt my hand tighten around the phone. Each word he had just said was landing like a stone. Show up correctly. As if my presence was a performance I had failed at. Did you move my money without my authorization? I asked. My voice was very quiet. He scoffed. It is our money, Natalie. Don't be dramatic about semantics. I asked again. Slower. Did you remove me from access lists on the property? He exhaled, irritated. You are acting like a victim, he said. And I could hear him pacing. Probably in his office, probably surrounded by the diplomas and awards that lined walls I had helped pay for. And it is not attractive. I closed my eyes. Did you tell staff I approved it? He didn't answer that one. Instead, he said, you are making this embarrassing for everyone. No, I replied, voice calm. You already handled that part. He tried to interrupt, but I kept going. Thank you for clarifying. I needed that on record, and I hung up. For a long moment, I just sat there. Then I opened my laptop and logged into the system. I rarely used the one with full administrative access to the resort's internal operations, guest services, and financial authorizations. For the first time in 5 years of marriage, I stopped pretending I was just Brandon's wife with a support role. I logged in as the chairwoman of the board that owned the property he was trying to erase me from. Years ago, my Aunt Eleanor told me something I didn't fully understand at the time. We were sitting in her study after that disastrous Christmas dinner, and she had just listened to me downplay what Celeste had said. Don't fix people who disrespect you, Eleanor said, pouring herself a scotch. Let the system fix them. I had asked what she meant. She looked at me hard. Quiet is useful, Natalie. Invisible is dangerous. The moment you let someone confuse the two, they will assume you have no other option. I had kept every email, every wire confirmation, every polite request Brandon had made for temporary help that was never repaid. I kept them not because I planned to weaponize them, but because some part of me knew that the story he was telling about us didn't match the receipts. Brandon thought I worked in operations because I liked being useful. He had no idea that operations meant I could see every transaction, every guest list edit, every authorization request that touched the properties my family controlled. What he didn't know, what he had never bothered to ask, was that when my father stepped back from active leadership 3 years ago, the board restructured, the majority voting shares transferred to me, not as a courtesy, not as a symbolic gesture, as a legal reality. I signed the payroll for the general managers. I approved the budgets. I had final authority on guest access protocols and fraud investigations. Brandon saw me as someone who handled admin. He never once considered that admin was another word for control. If he had known whose signature sat at the bottom of the staff hierarchy he was trying to manipulate, he wouldn't have made that call to Mara. He wouldn't have redirected my money with the confidence of someone who thought he had more authority than I did. But he didn't know, and I had spent 5 years not correcting him, because I wanted to see who he was when he thought I had no power. Now, I knew. I called Javier Ruiz, the general manager of the Park City property, from my office. Javier and I had worked together for 6 years. He knew exactly who I was. "Javier," I said, "I need you to pull some records for me." I asked for the transfer logs, the manifest edits, the call notes from Mara's conversation with Brandon, and the authorization chain for guest access changes. "Treat this exactly as you would if the guest making unauthorized changes were not married to me," I said. Javier didn't hesitate. "Understood, Madam Chair. I will have everything within the hour." An hour later, I was looking at a digital trail that was worse than I had imagined. Brandon hadn't just asked to move my money. He had told staff I had had an episode and requested discretion. He had framed my removal from the charter and the suite as a compassionate accommodation. He had lied to the people who worked for me, using language designed to make me sound unstable, and he had done it with the confidence of someone who believed no one would check. I called my chief legal officer, Miranda Chen. "I need you to flag this as a potential fraud case," I said, walking her through the timeline. She listened without interrupting, then asked a single question. "Do you want a public audit or a private resolution?" I thought about it. A private resolution would be quieter, cleaner. No one would have to know. But private also meant Brandon could rewrite the story, turn himself into the victim, and walk away with his reputation intact, while I stayed invisible public, I said. At the rehearsal dinner, in front of witnesses, that evening, I called Eleanor. "I am going to correct him," I told her. "In the same room where he tried to erase me." She was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Do you want them to hurt, or do you want the truth to stand still in the room?" I thought about it. "I want the truth to cost them something," I said. She laughed, low and approving. "Good. Then do it cleanly. Let the system speak first. You speak last." I didn't fly out on the charter. I booked a commercial first-class seat under my maiden name and arranged for a car to pick me up at the airport. I didn't tell Brandon I was coming. I didn't tell Celeste or Vivienne. I let them think I had taken the hint and stayed away. And while they were congratulating themselves on a problem solved, Javier and his team were preparing a file that would be delivered to me 30 minutes before the rehearsal dinner began. The rehearsal dinner was held on the terrace of the resort's private event wing, floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the mountains. 73 guests, most of them dressed in the kind of designer casual that costs more than most people's rent. I watched from the hallway as they mingled, champagne in hand, convinced they were among their own kind. Brandon was at the center of a group near the bar, laughing too loudly, playing the role of gracious brother-in-law. Celeste stood beside him in a dress that probably cost $8,000, holding court. I waited until the pre-dinner speeches were about to begin. Then, I walked in. The room didn't go silent immediately. It took a few seconds, one person noticing, then another, then a ripple of recognition spreading through the crowd. Brandon saw me and his face shifted through 3 emotions in rapid succession. Confusion, anger, disbelief. He crossed the room fast, voice low and furious. "You need to leave," he hissed. Right now, before he could grab my arm, Javier stepped into view from the staff entrance. "Sir," he said, calm and professional. "She does not need authorization to be here." Brandon looked at him like he had lost his mind. "I am handling this," Brandon said. Javier didn't move. "With respect, sir, you don't have the authority to handle this." That is when people started paying closer attention. Celeste walked over, her smile tight and dangerous. "This is such a dramatic misunderstanding," she said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Natalie, we can talk about this privately." I looked at her. "No," I said. "We will talk about it here publicly, the same way I was removed." I turned to Javier. Can you confirm the unauthorized changes made to my reservations and my deposit? He nodded and pulled a tablet from a folder. Yes, madam. On Wednesday at 1:53 p.m., a request was submitted to revoke suite credentials, remove a guest from the charter manifest, and redirect a $100,000 deposit to event beverage overages. The request cited guest instability and claimed verbal authorization, which we have determined was fabricated. The room had gone completely silent now. Brandon's face was going red. This is insane, he said, voice shaking. You are making a scene over a misunderstanding. I kept my voice level. It wasn't a misunderstanding, it was fraud. Vivienne stood up, champagne glass trembling slightly. Can we please not do this in public? She asked. I looked at her. Your son removed me in public. You can hear the correction the same way. Javier handed me the tablet. I glanced at the transfer logs, the call notes, the timestamps. Then I looked at Brandon. You used my money to buy visibility for people who thought I lowered the room, I said. He tried to speak. I kept going. You told staff I was unwell. You redirected funds without authorization, and you did it because you thought no one would check. A woman near the front, a friend of Celeste's, whispered something to the person next to her. I caught the words department store energy and felt something snap into place. I turned to address the full room. For clarity, I said. The woman you were told didn't belong here, signs the checks that keep this property operational. The silence was deafening. Celeste's face went pale. You own this place, she asked, voice barely above a whisper. I met her eyes. Majority control. Enough to know exactly who moved, what, when, and why. Brandon opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. You never told me, he finally managed. I tilted my head. You never asked. You assumed I was someone whose money you could move, and whose presence you could erase. You confused access with ownership. Javier's director of guest relations stepped forward with a second folder. Madam Chair, should I proceed with the financial audit and access review? I nodded. Yes. Reverse the fraudulent transfer, revoke Mr. Ashford's VIP privileges, and remove him from any decision-making authority on this property, effective immediately. Brandon's mother sank into a chair so fast, she nearly knocked over a champagne flute. Someone in the back gasped. Celeste looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. And Brandon just stared at me, his face a mixture of shock and humiliation, and something I couldn't name. I looked at him one last time. You were borrowing status from the woman you were trying to erase, I said. Then I turned to Javier. Please proceed with the event as planned. I will not be disrupting the wedding, but make sure all future requests from Mr. Ashford go through the appropriate channels. I looked at the room, enjoy your evening, and I walked out. By midnight, the financial reversal was complete. The $100,000 was back in my account. Brandon's master guest privileges his ability to charge to the room, make reservations, or request special accommodations were disabled across all 3 properties in the portfolio. The suite was reassigned under a security flag, meaning he had need written authorization to access it, and legal had informed him in writing that any further instructions from him to staff would be considered void unless they went through formal channels. He found me in the original suite an hour after the dinner ended. He didn't knock. He just walked in, and for a moment we stood there in silence. Why would you humiliate me like that? He finally asked. His voice was shaking. I turned from the window. I corrected you, I said publicly. There is a difference. He ran his hands through his hair, the gesture of a man who had lost control of a situation he thought he owned. I was trying to protect the family weekend, he said. I didn't want drama. I looked at him carefully. You mean, your image? You wanted me gone so you could take credit for generosity you funded with my money. He tried to soften his approach. We can fix this, he said. It was a misunderstanding. We will explain to people I cut him off. He blinked. What? I spoke slowly. Each word deliberate. We are done. This marriage is over. Every conversation from this point forward goes through counsel. And I will not be funding any more image expenses. Not the club, not the trips. Not the version of yourself you have been building on my balance sheet. He stared at me. You cannot be serious. I met his eyes. You don't get to spend me and then resent where it came from. I walked past him toward the door. Your sister's wedding will proceed as planned. But you and I are finished. I paused at the threshold. Consider the correction complete. The immediate aftermath was chaos, dressed up as composure. Brandon's family tried to spin the story stress, miscommunication, the pressure of a big event, bringing out the worst in everyone. Vivienne called a few people the next morning, her voice carefully modulated, suggesting that I had overreacted to a simple coordination issue. But too many people had witnessed what happened. The transfer reversal was documented in the resort's financial system. The staff had seen the authorization chain, and the guests who had been in that room couldn't unknow what they had learned. The woman they had dismissed as corporate and a little much was the one who actually controlled the property they were standing on. Within 3 days, the Whisper network had done its work. I started getting calls from people I hadn't spoken to in years, suddenly interested in reconnecting. A venture capitalist who had ignored me at a gala 8 months earlier wanted to grab coffee and talk about hospitality tech. A woman who had been at the rehearsal dinner sent a long email about how she had always admired my quiet strength and wanted to discuss a partnership opportunity. A few were genuine old colleagues who had heard what happened and wanted to check if I was okay. Most were recalculating their social math, trying to figure out if being on my good side was now a strategic necessity. I ignored them all. I wasn't interested in becoming someone's networking target, just because they would finally notice I had power. Brandon moved out of our Manhattan apartment 2 weeks after the wedding. He took his clothes, his diplomas, the golf clubs I had bought him for his birthday, and the watch I had given him for our 2nd anniversary, a Rolex Submariner that had cost $14,000. He left behind a stack of unopened bills, a drawer full of unpaid parking tickets, and a handwritten note on cream-colored stationery that said, "I hope you are happy now." I wasn't happy, but I was clear. And clarity, I was learning, was better than the exhausting performance of peace. The financial consequences were immediate and severe. I cut Brandon off from every joint account that wasn't legally required to remain shared during divorce proceedings. The black Amex card he had been using, the one with no preset spending limit that was technically in my name, canceled. The pending reimbursements he had promised to handle, eventually $4, $200 for a business dinner he had expensed to me, $7, $800 for a client development trip to Napa that I later learned had been a bachelor party. I demanded documentation and formal repayment schedules. His lifestyle, which had been propped up by my network, my money, and my quiet facilitation, collapsed like scaffolding without a structure beneath it. His boutique consulting firm, the one that had required $38,000 in bridge money, shuttered within 2 months. It turned out the clients he had been courting weren't interested in his services. They were interested in access to me, to the properties I controlled, to the network I could activate, to the introductions I could make. When I was no longer in the picture, the invitations to pitch meetings dried up. The LinkedIn messages stopped. The exploratory conversations that had once seemed so promising evaporated. One of his former clients sent me a direct message. "I worked with Brandon because I thought he had connections. Turns out you were the connection." I didn't respond. The $12,600 club membership he had insisted was essential to his business development. The one where he had promised he would make it back in referrals within 6 months came up for renewal in June. He couldn't afford it. He called me, voice tight, asking if we could work something out since the membership had technically been for both of us. I reminded him that I would never once set foot in that club, had never wanted the membership, and had only agreed to pay for it because he had said it was critical to his career. He said I was being petty. I said I was being precise. The membership lapsed. The private travel he had booked and canceled and rebooked, using points from my corporate credit card, the same card I had added him to as an authorized user. When we first got married, suddenly became impossible to coordinate. I removed him as an authorized user. The next time he tried to book something, the card declined. He had to start flying commercial, in middle seats. On overnight connections, I didn't take pleasure in it, exactly, but I didn't look away from it either. The The social consequences were even more surgical, more targeted, more personal than I had anticipated. Celeste and Vivienne tried to save face by framing the rehearsal dinner as an unfortunate family misunderstanding. Tempers flared. People said things they didn't mean. We are all just trying to move forward. But the people in that room had heard me speak in precise financial terms. They had seen Javier call me Madam Chair. They had watched Brandon's face go from red to white to gray, as he realized he had been publicly corrected by the person whose authority he had tried to override. And in the kind of social circles Brandon and his family moved in, that kind of humiliation doesn't fade. It calcifies. The phrase department store energy became a kind of boomerang. Women who had heard Celeste say it, who would maybe even laughed at the time, relieved to not be the target, started to reconsider what they had witnessed. Because if the woman with department store energy was actually the one signing the paychecks, what did that say about the people mocking her? The cruelty didn't disappear, but it got quieter, and several women who had been on the receiving end of similar comments reached out to tell me they had felt seen. One of them, a financial analyst who had been dismissed at the same Christmas dinner for being too numbers-focused, sent me a bottle of champagne with a note that read, "For knowing your worth." The bride and groom managed to salvage their wedding day. I made sure of that. I didn't want collateral damage. The ceremony went forward, the vows were exchanged, the cake was cut, but the behind-the-scenes reality was shattered. Brandon spent the ceremony looking like a man at a funeral, his jaw tight, his smile forced. His mother cried through the vows, and not in the joyful way her mascara ran. Her shoulders shook, and she had to leave halfway through to compose herself. And Celeste, who had planned this weekend as her crowning social moment, the event that would cement her status in a particular tier of New York society, spent most of it trying to avoid eye contact with anyone who had been in that rehearsal dinner. 3 weeks after the wedding, Brandon sent me a text. It came through at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday. I panicked. It read, "I didn't think it would go that far. Can we talk, please?" I read it twice. Then I deleted it without responding. Vivienne called a few days later, her voice thick with tears. "Family shouldn't destroy family over money," she said. "We have always been there for each other. This isn't who we are." I thought about that for a long time. Then I replied, "You are right. In that family, money was the family. And I am done funding people who see me as a transaction." She hung up. I never heard from her again. 3 months later, I filed for divorce. Brandon's attorney tried to argue for a larger settlement, citing his contributions to the household and career sacrifices made to support the marriage. My attorney presented the wire transfer records, every $38,000 bridge loan, every $12,600 membership, every $9,400 expense I had covered with promises of repayment that never materialized. We presented the reimbursement requests that were never honored. We documented the pattern of financial misrepresentation, the way Brandon had presented my money as family money, or our resources, while simultaneously excluding me from the narrative of success. We settled in mediation. He walked away with significantly less than he had hoped for, and significantly more than he had earned. His attorney called it a learning experience. My attorney called it justice. By 6 months, the shift in how people saw me was complete, and I hated it. Because they didn't start respecting me because they had suddenly recognized my competence or my value as a person. They started respecting me because I had made my power visible, because I had demonstrated that I could hurt someone publicly, because I had shown that I had resources they might want access to someday. The same people who had ignored me when I was quiet suddenly wanted to be in business with me now that they knew I controlled things they wanted. It was the same transactional thinking Brandon had operated with, just with better manners and more carefully worded emails. But there were small victories. Mara, the concierge who had made that first call to warn me, was promoted to director of guest relations. I made sure of that. She had done the right thing in an impossible situation, and I wanted her to know that integrity had consequences that weren't always punitive. We implemented new authorization protocols across all property staff protection policies that made it harder for guests to manipulate or gaslight employees, especially when family connections were involved. I restructured my public role in the company. I stopped pretending to be smaller than I was to make other people comfortable. I attended board meetings under my own name. I gave interviews about hospitality leadership. I let people see that the woman who signed the paychecks wasn't someone to be dismissed as admin or mocked as corporate. And I stopped apologizing for taking up space in rooms I would paid to build. 1 year after the rehearsal dinner, I stood on the same terrace where it had all unraveled. I was there for a leadership retreat, not a wedding. The mountains looked the same. The glass walls still reflected the sky in that particular way that made you feel suspended between earth and air. But I wasn't the same person who had walked into that room a year ago. The thing I hadn't expected was grief. Not for Brandon, I had mourned that marriage the moment I understood what it was. But grief for the version of myself who had believed that being quiet and competent and endlessly accommodating would be enough to earn respect. Grief for all the times I had made myself smaller, because I thought that was the price of belonging. Grief for the years I would let someone else narrate my worth. There was one unexpected grace note. Brandon's younger brother Lucas sent me a letter 6 months after the divorce was finalized. "I should have said something," he wrote. "I watched them treat you like furniture, expensive, useful, but not quite family. I stayed silent because it was easier. I am sorry. It was the only apology I received from anyone in that family, and it mattered. Not because it changed what had happened, but because it reminded me that not everyone in that room had been complicit. Some had just been quiet, like I had been for too long." Today, I am sitting in my office on the 32nd floor of a building in Manhattan, looking out at a city that never stops rewriting itself. There is a coffee on my desk, black, no sugar, and a folder with next quarter's acquisition targets. Outside, it is snowing the way it only does in New York in early March. Soft and temporary, and strangely hopeful. I still own the resort in Park City. I still sign the paychecks, but I don't go there for family events anymore, because I don't have that family, and I have made peace with that. Here is what I have learned. First, there are people who don't love you. They love what they can attach their name to. They love the doors you open, the money you provide, the status you confer. And the moment you ask them to see you as something other than a resource, they will frame you as difficult, dramatic, or damaged. That is not love. That is extraction. Second, when you make yourself smaller to make someone else comfortable, they start to believe your smallness is your natural size. They will forget you ever had edges. They will forget you ever said no. And when you finally take up the space you have always been entitled to, they will call it aggression. They will call it a betrayal. They will say you have changed. They are right. You have. You have stopped performing their version of you. Third, silence is not always dignity. Sometimes it is just the sound of letting someone else write your story wrong. And the longer you stay silent, the harder it becomes to correct the record without being labeled bitter, vindictive, or unhinged. There is a difference between choosing your battles and letting people win by default. If you are watching this and you have ever been needed privately but disrespected publicly, if you have ever funded someone's image while being told you didn't fit the aesthetic, if you have ever been called dramatic for asking people to stop lying about you, I want you to know something. You are not too sensitive, you are not asking for too much, and you don't owe anyone a performance of gratitude for the privilege of being used.